So I will now introduce our moderator, Ranga Jayaraman.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. What we're planning to do is to cover the history of, evolution of computing within the GSB over a period of 3 decades, starting 1975 and going all the way through 2005. The title of the panel says, Bridging into the Future, and we all know that future is always moving ahead of us. It doesn't stay there for us to reach it. So that means this bridge is forever being built. It just, span after span is being added. So we'll kind of look at, 3 spans, each span about, a decade or so. Just reflecting on this and kind of looking up our trusted and true source of information, namely Wikipedia, there's a very, very interesting, depiction of the timeline of computing over these last, 4 decades or so. And it's just amazing how much has evolved in the history of computing, in the capability with respect to computing in these last 4 decades. And if you look over the last 2 decades or so, that rate of evolution of the computing as a capability in the world and its impact on just about everything that we do is just really amazing, just to see. I'm Ranga Jayaraman. My association with the school is the shortest of the people that are sitting here. I've been here only about 4.5 years, since about early 2011. And I'll serve as the moderator, and just very briefly by way of introduction, before I became a corporate refugee in higher education space, I was in the corporate world about 3 decades, working primarily in the high-tech industry, companies like IBM, Hitachi, and NVIDIA before coming to GSB. And since I came here, I've had enormous amount of fun in terms of dealing with technology and its impact on the school. I'm going to invite our panelists to introduce themselves in regard to their association with the school and their association with the technology. And then we will go through, as I said, these 3 decades and dwell deeper into each of those decades for the school. Let me start with Jeff Moore.
My association with the GSB began in the early 1970s. I was hired as a faculty member into a newly created group called CIS, Computers and Information Systems, that was within the business school. And between the time that the job offer was extended and I arrived, the group was canceled. And so I arrived into a group which was being disbanded. And that led to a rather rough start as my career here as a faculty member. I kept that for about 10 years. And then in response to a competitive offer from one of our other business schools to try to attract me away, they made me an offer to be a half-time faculty member and then half-time the chief technology officer for the school. And I accepted that and fulfilled that role for about 20 years until the late 90s. And then the demand had grown for more faculty, and so I reverted back to being a full-time faculty member for the next 11 years before my retirement. And the administrative applications that I got involved in were somewhat indirect during all of that time, as we had hired a series of computer directors and managers. But as the person responsible largely for strategy, both on the teaching and research and the administrative side, I had my fingers in various pies, even though I wasn't directly managing a lot of that. So I'll talk about the administrative applications. We had a previous session on teaching and research, so we'll try to focus more on the administrative growth, as Ranga mentioned, over the last 3 decades or so.
Tony Holland. Tony?
And I have a sort of a pathway as far as my involvement with Stanford. I came to California in '73 with a computer company, and my first location as a field engineer was working at Stanford University. So in '73, I was on campus working on computers that were in place around the research centers and the data centers and things like that. I later went to work for SRI International, which used to be affiliated with Stanford University. I was there about 13 years. Formed their decentralized IT organization for them back in the day before, at that time it was just really MIS. And so I was forming the basically distributed computing capabilities for them. I went on to industry, Novell, and then was recruited here in 1998 to be director of the IT organization at the school, which I then left. I'd actually been promoted and then left to go to the university, recruited to the university for about 2.5 years, where I ran networks and telecommunications project management office. And then I was recruited to come back here to work with Randy Yee, who had replaced me as the CIO. So that's really, and now I'm working for Ranga. So that's my track record.
Thank you, Tony. So we'll start with the first of these decades, 1975 to 1985. Just something of a little personal note on that time period. I came to Stanford in '78, and over the next 3-4 years working in a lab in mechanical engineering department, and we had a mini computer, a PDP, and then a microcomputer for the lab in terms of doing the experiments and all of that. So very early stages of really computers impacting stuff in research side of the thing was my exposure to the to that era. And I'll start with Jeff, since I think he was very heavily involved in this time period. And kind of the motivating questions for his remarks that I would ask is, looking at that period, what were some very significant key, technology events or things in the School of Business? And in particular, why did they come about, or how did they come about, and what were their impact or outcomes for the school? And most importantly, are there some juicy stories that are associated with that period as it relates to technology and its deployment within that school, 75 to 85?
Well, certainly, we've talked about this, and we agree we're going to tell some war stories. The problem was character assassination and the threat of lawsuits that might, but we decided, oh, to hell with it. We're going to just tell it as we saw it.
It's all in good spirit.
Yeah, right. Because that's where I think the thrill associated with technology and its management and implementation comes from, are the actual experiences, all of which have, I think, war stories to share. We hope the audience will contribute at the end to this. A couple of things as a preamble to this. As Ranga mentioned, we're going to talk about roughly 3 decades, the first 3 decades, even though it began nearly 40 years ago. But there are a couple of things that I need to remind you of, because you forget so easily. I remember my daughter's shock when she realized that I grew up without a cell phone, and she just could not process that. And a similar thing was happening over this period of time. I did a quick calculations. If you look at Moore's Law, unfortunately not named after me. I have my own law, but it didn't make the cut. This is Gordon Moore's Law, which was roughly a doubling of the density of circuitry every 24 months or so. So over that period, there have been 20 doublings, which calculates to a 1,000,000-fold improvement in performance. Now, that turns out that the teaching and research uses of computing would take instant advantage of those improvements. Administrative uses, not quite so much. The real demand for administrative use centered around databases, storage of large quantities of information, and so on. Those were typically on electromechanical devices and early technology such as this. It improved, but not as dramatically over this time period. The other thing you have to keep in mind is just correct for the prices. Some of the prices we'll be quoting will be in the nominal dollars of the time. And if you just correct for inflation, you have to kind of multiply everything by roughly a factor of 5 to get a rough comparison to what would be in today's dollars. The other thing is that there was, like now, just an incredible amount of hype associated with the potential impact of the technology. And it was probably more present at Stanford than in most of our competitor business schools because of our affiliation with technology in the Valley. But the hyperbole was unbelievable, which set people's expectations unreasonably high at almost all times. And so a lot of the sources of the war stories we're going to tell are because of miscalibration.
Mismatched expectations.
Expectations being much too high relative to what could possibly be delivered. I will start, in fact, he's a member of the audience here who became involved in the first of what we might be called IT disasters. The business school in the late 1960s received a gift from IBM Corporation of an IBM 1401, which was a mini computer that at the time sold for approximately $100,000 to $200,000. And again, you have to multiply that by roughly 5 to get a rough order of magnitude. So we got roughly $1 million gift from IBM of a computer. And the question is what to do with it. It turns out that that computer was designed for business applications. It had no research software, no database, and it was designed primarily, it was a very successful computer by IBM, designed for invoicing and billing and payroll and things of that sort. So it was passed around. The faculty had no interest in it. It was ultimately then passed to a committee of people who were looking at the business school data processing needs, but nobody understood how to use it. No one had any programming experience. And what happened was actually quite embarrassing. The machine was returned to IBM unopened. An outright gift was refused by the leading corporation in business computing in the world at the time because we were simply unprepared to take advantage of it. And this was not the first time that this has happened over the last 30 years or so. It was prior to my time, but much of the hyperbole that's associated with what could be done with computing is complicated by the fact that on the teaching and research side, in some respects it's easier, despite the fact that it tends to be more bleeding edge. Why is that? Well, because you're dealing with an individual faculty member who's doing an individual research project, who has individual needs. Or you're dealing with a course and you're introducing some technology in a course, but the course is episodic, taught once a year, maybe twice a year. And so you could start with what we would call a greenfield approach to the technology and designing it. Contrast that with administrative use. With administrative uses of computing, you're required to innovate, to change, to introduce new ideas and new technologies, all the while keeping the ship afloat. Right. Continuing to support the existing repertoire of services. And it tends to be tightly coupled. You can't separate out the way you can research. There might be some areas, such as maybe admissions, or possibly the registrar function, that might be somewhat separable. But most of the rest of the school is tightly coupled from a business standpoint. And so it becomes very much more difficult to innovate because you have to move people along who are often naive about technology, particularly at first, while they're still working what, 150% time to meet the needs of their current jobs and also do all these new things that were supposed to be so much easier.
So change was hard even in that decade, not just,
In many respects, it was worse because expectations were so very high, and it was so very difficult as a result to introduce new things. I can tell a few stories about one of the things that happened, particularly we're going back now to the 1970s. The university, of course, was moving ahead with lots of technologies in computer science. Silicon Valley was getting itself established and so forth. And you began to see early generations of personal computers showing up. And so the question was what to do about that. Our first investments were clearly on the teaching and research side.
So these were the kind like Apples and Ataris.
Apple IIs. We actually got a gift of Atari, if you remember that. That was a game, but they actually had what was essential at the time. They supported VisiCalc. And the spreadsheet turned out to be the key technology that we were interested in. And so the question is, how do we support it? We had exactly one employee, full-time, at the time, who was not even a high school graduate, whose job was to do backups, to create tape backups of things, and that was it. There was no director, there was no manager, there was no infrastructure at all. Everything
There
was
wasn't
being
really
done.
an organization.
There was no organization at all. Everything was done ad hoc. So we had to begin to build things on our own. The emphasis initially was on the teaching and research applications, but one of the first applications became the use of the registrar's office. And again, I'll have to cite my colleague, Chuck Benini, who's in the audience here. He came up with an idea for allocating elective courses to students. And that's an administrative application. How do you assign students when there's excess demand for some electives? How do you do the triage necessary to do that without alienating large groups of students?
We are still struggling with that problem.
Well,
we haven't solved that problem.
well, one of the issues that was associated with that was his idea, which I'll give him full credit for, was not to create a funny money system, which other business schools were trying because they were dominated by economists. His idea was to do rank ordering. So students would list in rank order their preferences for various elective courses. And when I saw the proposal, I said, gee, that looks like something that could be done on our own. Rather than doing it manually, we could put that on a computer. So what we'll do is temporarily, just as an expedient, I'll write a little program to do that, and it turned out to be on an early generation IBM PC. I chose a language, a very sophisticated language that did linear algebra and matrix manipulation techniques because there were arrays of students and arrays of courses and so forth. It was a stopgap measure until such time as we could outsource it to be done professionally. What was interesting about that story is that, like many IT applications, I think, that happen in organizations, they grow up like weeds. And they develop roots that become very, very commingled and almost impossible to dislodge. And that's exactly what happened. It was actually quite successful. The students were very happy with the outcomes by and large, not so much because they got the courses they wanted, but because we could demonstrate to them the rationale for why they may have lost out.
It's a systematic process.
And so we could, by systematizing it, we were able to raise people's average level of satisfaction. The problem was, and it was only done 3 times a year. That was the good news. The problem was everybody was so busy doing so many other new and interesting things with computers that this thing, which was working, got low priority. And so I kept saying, look, remember, this was just an ad hoc, piece of software that was done, not documented, not systematized. And every quarter I would remind the deans that if I get hit by a truck, we will not be able to register students at the GSB into classes.
And the response was, don't get hit by the truck.
Exactly. The response was, you're absolutely right. Let's put that on the list. And invariably, it would get pushed down the list and pushed down the list. And 12 years, I personally registered all the students at the business school into courses, not because it was of interest to me, but because I couldn't pass the baton
you were stuck
to anybody.
with it.
I got stuck with it.
He tried passing it to me.
And we kept saying, no, we of course modified it. We collected the data over the web when the web became popular. We distributed the results electronically and so forth. But the actual allocation of students to class was literally done by storing the information on a database that was running on a single PC in the registrar's office. And it took me, as I say, 12 years to pass that baton for the school to finally accept it and make it a web-based application, which is still being used today, more or less. It keeps getting modified. But that's a very typical sort of thing that would happen in these early years. If you have an application that seems to get by and to work, it's suddenly difficult to really make it part of an overall system. And this was one of the big difficulties and big challenges is how do you build an organization to support a lot of ad hocery that has grown up because the software doesn't exist in the marketplace to do the kinds of educational computing that we need at the same time while you're doing all the other things that the school has focused upon.
So that's really a very key point, Jeff, that you've made, that from being ad hoc, starting with one or two people, we needed to shift more and more towards being more systematic, having more of an organization. So were there additional growth in the organization as this particular 10 years?
And of course, it was a selling point internally. This was the good news is that you're dealing with really, really smart senior people. And the senior people were the deans and associate deans, all of whom either had industry experience or who had done research in business. And so we're not as close-minded as you might find in some areas of the private sector. But you would still get some naivete. For example, I was once asked by one of the associate deans, with the improvement in Moore's law, with the continual decrease of the cost of computing, how come the IT budget keeps doubling every year? And I said, oh, well, you're not familiar with Moore's corollary, which says that the capital investment doubles every year as the improvement. And if you extrapolate it out, the entire world GDP will be devoted to supporting IT groups by turn of the 21st century. At first, it certainly looked that way. We grew from having one person to a group of about 5. Then we hired a first director, and thereby hangs a tale. One of the first directors that we hired was a very competent female who happened to have a master's degree in statistics. She was married, and her husband worked across campus. So the story goes, they wanted to send love notes as email messages to each other. And so the two of them together invented the router. And from that founded a company called Cisco and became extremely successful entrepreneurs. it's a complete lie. That never
It's a
happened.
good tall tale.
It's a great tall tale. It's become part of the Cisco culture now. The fact of the matter is the routing function was developed as part of ARPA investments, and it existed for decades. What they did invent was a low-cost multi-protocol router that turned out to be economically very successful and allowed them to create what became a dominant company in that area. But we had the unfortunate outcome. I was hired as a consultant, the first consultant to this new startup, and offered a founder's stock.
So you must be a very wealthy man now.
Well, what happened was the following. I didn't add much value. I told them Cisco was a bad name because anyone of my generation associates Cisco with the Cisco Kid, who was a popular cowboy in the 1950s and 60s on television. And you have to have an X in your name. If you're going to be a high-tech company, you have to have an X in your name. And Cisco does not have an X in the name. They rejected my advice, and I never received the founder's stock as a result of that. But one of the problems that happened, jumping ahead, we had gotten grants from HP and IBM. We had elected to go with philanthropy to finance it, which hangs an interesting tale. The committee to decide what to do about computing. It was obvious we were going to do something about personal computing. The question is what? Should students be required to buy it? Should we supply it? And so forth. And I remember as a part of the study, we visited our chief competitor at the time, the Harvard Business School. And the dean at the time, when I was introduced to him, said that he thought it would be very, very useful for the two schools to cooperate on this and not to compete. Because he thought that with a budget of $16 million, that Harvard should be doing a much better job. And I was terrifically impressed by that because at that time, if you've never visited the Harvard Business School campus, we had one building at that time, the old business school building. Harvard had 22 buildings across the Charles River campus. Our budget for the business school was $10 million, and Harvard's was only $16 million. And so this huge enterprise had a budget that was only 60% bigger. When I mentioned that, everyone howled and said, no, 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 you don't understand. Our budget for computing is $16 million. The GSB's entire budget for the entire school was $10 million at that time.
And it's not a whole lot different now, by the way.
It's always been a case, people don't realize, it's always been a case of David versus Goliath. And that's a better metaphor associated. And it applies to administrative computing as well as to other uses of computing. We've always been kind of lean and mean. And we had to struggle with how do we find competent people willing to do the hard work that's required to do it at the university pay scales, which was below that of the private market here. To finish up, and I'll turn it over to Tony, one of the things that we had as a major issue at one point, we had hired a director who wanted to get the popular technology, we're now talking 1980s, the dominant technology that was being introduced at that time was we now call EIS, Executive Information Systems. It started out in manufacturing in the private sector. The leading proponent, a very successful company, European company, was SAP. Started out in manufacturing. And the idea was to get away from the ad hocery of all these individual applications that didn't talk to one another, that had to have customized support and the like. Should we acquire an executive information system to run the business school administratively? And the answer was, well, let's see if we can find something, because we could not afford to develop our own. So a study was done, And we found a vendor, a company called SRN, located in Washington State, that had developed some tailored systems, administrative systems for education. The problem was it ran on an HP 3000. An HP 3000 was a mini computer-based system. We had committed to machines from IBM and to a lesser extent Apple. And on the mainframe side, we had purchased machines from Digital Equipment Corporation, which at that time was the second largest computer company in the world. And the HP 3000 was yet another platform to support. And so I did a tally, and I said, wait a minute, we are supporting 10 different platforms with this IT group, ranging from Apple IIs to Macintoshes to IBM System 6 word processing systems to the DEC 20s, which were large mainframes, to a DEC VAX 11, which was a mini computer. We were supporting, later in the 80s, the web. And we had web servers, NetWare web servers that we were running and so forth. And I said, now we're going to have to buy another software package running on a completely different hardware platform. The dean at the time was Mike Spence, and he was an economist by training and had, I think, a very wise attitude. And I have to confess, I should have thought of it myself and didn't. He said, okay, if this is the software that does the job, what will it cost us in order to support yet another platform? And I had not done that calculation. And I went back and said, well, now that you mention it, we'll have to do training, we'll have to send someone to conferences and so forth. Yeah, we'll have to hire at least 2 more people. And that's a 10% growth in the IT group. And his response, a good economist that he was, is that all? You mean I can spread oil over troubled waters by only having to hire 2 more people? And I said, well, yeah. And he said, done deal. And that's exactly what we did. We bought yet another platform, an HP 3000, running a system that was tailored primarily to student record keeping, registration, providing some library support, and the like, which we used for almost a decade before we then later switched to the so-called PeopleSoft, which we'll come back and talk about later, but let me turn the baton over to Tony.
So actually, let me bridge that. I mean, so clearly what Jeff was describing is, with the advent of technology in the world, how the school essentially started adopting the technology in addition to, of course, the teaching and learning side, the research side of it, into the administrative side, with having to go from 1 or 2 people who were not necessarily, trained people in the technology to having an organization. Now, Tony, you've been associated with a time period in the school where that was taken to much higher levels of refinement into a professional organization and so on. So maybe you could start with, the time period over which, you were part of all of that and hit the same highlights in terms of, what were events, why and how, and the juicy stories.
Sure. So yeah, there is that period in there that we're missing towards the early 90s. I came to the school in 1998, but the story really starts from what I've been able to gather from mid-1997. The school, as you heard, Dean Spence was here. School was feeling like they were really far behind, and when I got here, I could say yes, they were probably pretty far behind in 1997 with technology and actually how they competed in the marketplace. If you think of education as a marketplace, how they competed for students, for research, and all of that, and technology really wasn't where it meant to be. So he mentioned the DEC 20s, they were history. There was another technology in there that was really used for file management, file systems, NetWare. Some of you may remember those days. It was really a departmental level file system management system for people. The school had that for what they referred to as their M drive, which is still referred to today for some of us who haven't gone fully to Google. But it was really big in those days to have a network-based file system. Prior to that, you really had your disk drive on the computer, and you did floppies or did some form of transfer to get the files moved around. Well, in mid 1997, the school came up with this really visionary idea and connected, and it was working with some of the students. I don't know who they were, but they connected the ideas together and approached HP and Microsoft to provide a gift to the school to really help it bring its technology up to date and to really leapfrog where it had been to try to get us to current state. So the gift involved HP giving us like 150 desktops that we really needed, I guess, and then a number of servers that would run Windows operating system from Microsoft. Microsoft offered us email system, a modern Exchange email system, which we had then. Following that, we had that until Ranga got here in 2011. So it was a sustainable, capable system. But so the idea was to create an online capability for the school, registration system, calendar, community, clubs, all of that information would be online for the students. A web presence, a robust web presence. Prior to that, I guess it was pretty weak capability that they had. So that was what they started in the mid-1997. At the same time, the administration of the school started talking about, well, you know, industry looks like outsourcing is the big thing. We should be thinking about outsourcing IT services. And so they mentioned this to the IT organization that was there at the time. And so they have this big initiative going on that's going to really require a focus of not just IT, but the whole school, at the same time as they surprise the IT organization by announcing that, oh, by the way, someday your job might not be here. So you can imagine what happened. It became dysfunctional. The team started wondering, well, why am I doing this? And eventually what happened over the next 6 months is, from what I can see, is that a bulk of the IT organization disappeared. We had several staff disappear, managers left the organization. They were bringing in contractors for the consulting work to do with the project. At the same time, they were having to also bring in contractors to backfill for the staff. During this time, it was interesting because they were trying to do this to make things better, but what really happened was the Exchange server, the complaints were that it was down at least once a day, if not multiple times a day. The applications that Microsoft, not that it was their fault, but the applications that were being developed with their assistance weren't really meeting the needs. They weren't functioning the way, and so they didn't have the new state that they want, but yet they had basically abandoned the old state that they were in. So they were in this sort of quandary. Mm-hmm. So this went on for more than, looks like more than 8 months. And so around January is when I got contacted. I'd seen a posting in a job site for Stanford Graduate School of Business. As I said earlier on, hey, I'd been at the university for a while. It'd be interesting to come back. I was tired of traveling. I've spent half the week in Utah every week, so I wanted to be home with my young kids. And so I said, hey, this is worth an opportunity for me to talk to them about. We talked, Karen Wilson, who was the associate dean at the time for information resources. She had just gotten that position in the December before. She was recruiting me. We were talking. I noticed that things were sort of fluid. It started out as an associate director position, but somewhere along the way I said to my wife, I said, you know, this thing says it's a director position. I wonder what's going on there. And so in the spring I came to the school to meet for the first time to interview, and I interviewed with the dean and Karen Nuremberg, who is the associate dean for external relations. And they laid out a scenario for me, which was, here's the situation we find ourselves in. And so they described the scenario where they had wanted to upgrade the file servers, which were the M drives at the time for the different constituents, and they were upgrading the storage capacity of those. And because of a process failure, the upgrade failed. And the systems were unrecoverable. So no big deal for most IT organizations. You go to tape and you restore the files. No big deal. I'd just actually gone through that. One of our engineers had made a mistake and pulled a drive, and while it was recovering from that, it pulled another drive, and it wasn't a big deal. Within a couple of hours, we had restored the whole system, rolled forward the database, and everything was just fine. The story they described was they went to get the tapes, and they found tapes were mislabeled. They found they thought there should have been a tape, but there was no tape. They found tapes that had nothing on them. So basically, they were in a situation where, at first glance, they had lost all of the school's information. Luckily, there were still data on local computers. Not all of the tapes were blank. There were some recoverable. So they, in the end, after quite a bit of work, they were able to recover most of the information. But they still lost some faculty research. They lost some PhD research. And you can imagine the school was really stressed over this. And so they were really concerned about the school's reputation. So they started asking, well, what would you do in this situation? So we talked through that. And then 3 months later, I came on board as the director. And then it was, I said in here, I turned it around. They said, now what are you going to do to fix this problem is really what happened. But it describes a situation where the community really wants to move forward with technology, but doesn't think through the consequences and doesn't actually scope it in a way that makes sense, that allows it to be achievable over time. They really went for what would be perceived as a big bang approach. They really said, we're just going to do it all and just try to accomplish that in as short a time as possible to leapfrog from where they were. So that was an interesting approach to how they dealt with that. So
I mean, clearly was an extraordinarily opportune time frame to
it
come
was
into
wonderful for me. I love that
organization.
type of opportunity. That's the type of
And
opportunity.
maybe you can comment some more about, how did then the school IT organization evolve from that state
Yeah,
over, probably through 2000s in terms
Yeah.
of becoming a very, professional part of the school.
So after that, there wasn't a lot of trust in the organization. IT really was feared anytime they came around. It was like people were nervous. But after about 2 years, what I did was we rehired a lot of people. They didn't go forward with the outsourcing at the time. It was more talk than it was more of strategy than they had an execution behind it. But at the same point, they scared people enough that they moved on. But anyway, we rebuilt the IT organization. A lot of processes were put in place. We looked to others to help us do some of this, such as the University IT organization is what we really did. And then we actually started communicating more effectively. As changes were being planned, we had conversations with the community about what we were planning. As we rolled through it, they understood what we were doing. I recalled that after about 2 years, those negative responses I was getting from faculty had sort of almost diminished. There were still some cases where if our email server went down, you would have a faculty member panic over, oh my God, did you lose all my email or something like that. But I think that we got through it pretty well. But in 2000 was, from an organizational standpoint, 2000 was the dot-com craze, if you remember that. Mm-hmm. That's where it was just like right after that was when all of that happened. And it was, the way I say it is we participated in that craze as well. It was really meant about the industry and all that, but being here, everybody felt it and acted as if they were really ingrained in it. And so it affected everything. It affected our students they came here presumably to be full-time students, but we found so many times that they were out, some of them were out trying to do startups. And if you think about startups today, where you have all these support systems that help these startups achieve their objectives, well, in 2000, it was the Wild West of startups. It was, you were on your own and you had to figure it all out. So you had students trying to do that, do everything there. Staffing, I was trying to rebuild the organization. Anybody that was an IT professional had a job. So that means we were all competing for each other's staff. I recall that there was a story out in the industry that people were hiring people sight unseen. You'd talk to them on the phone and say, here's your job offer. And I even experienced that. I was interviewing someone for a developer position, talking to them on the phone, and halfway through the conversation they go, well, are you going to offer me a job? Because I've got this job with this company and this job with this company offers. Can you beat that? I mean, that was the level to the craziness that had happened within the industry. Technology, you didn't have to actually do anything. All you had to do is create an idea and at least start it, and then someone else would buy it from you. So it didn't matter how much you paid this technology person, because what you were really doing was you were setting yourself up to be sold for lots of money. So that really drove the craziness within the IT organizations, especially here. And then the school, you know, the original reason that they did the Microsoft gift and what they did there was they were trying to move forward. Well, because of the mistakes that happened, they really lost 2 years because of trying to recover from that, and no one was going to trust us to do anything with regards to something as critical as the business processes at that point. So it took us 2 years to get through that, but then they said, okay, it's time to look at that again. So they created an initiative that we called Best Web. Some of you may remember that. It was interesting time, another interesting time, but this time, though, we had a steering committee. We had professional consultants who came in, consulted with us. But even with that, we made mistakes because it was in the middle of the dot-com period when everything was really crazy. All these new technologies were coming out, but they were really technologies for e-commerce. They weren't technologies for us. And the consultants were advising us as if we were a business and industry player rather than an educational institution. So we started developing the platforms in which we were going to do, such as basically our portal environment, our intranet, and we realized partway through that the technologies really weren't the best fit, and that, it was more than we really should have taken on. So about 2001, the end of 2001, we decided to declare victory. We had just completed the student portal, but hadn't finished any of the other things that we had hoped to do, such as enterprise content management, infrastructure for single sign-on authentication across all the systems here and at the university that we touched, and directory profile services. Really didn't reach any of those. But we did get through that part of it, and then we recovered from that through a revisiting of it following that. I'd hired Randy Yee as the person to lead that effort for us and also run our web development team. About that time was when I moved on to the university, and then they had him become the CIO. And that was really a good choice for the school because Randy came with industry experience, but not just industry experience because you can take it the wrong direction, as you saw we could do with Best Web, but also with process. So he really understood organizations and processes, and that was really what we saw as how we really saw ourselves transforming as an organization. Back in '99, Karen and I talked about, we're a technology group, but if we're ever going to be successful in the school, we need to have credibility with regards to the business. So how is the business process done at the school? Can we help with that, understand it, and help with technology for that? So that was our first entry into business analysis. We had recruited Sue Dismuke, who was the registrar in 1999, and then following that, Ursula Kaiser there, who was the financial aid director. She came into the organization, and then later Randy recruited Rachel Kruger and yet another person. So in that period of that first 5 years of the 2000s was really a formative period for the organization. We really did develop, I'd say, the capabilities to be an enterprise type of organization that could deliver services beyond just basic technology and support services, because that was really critical to go beyond that, because that's what the school needed.
So we kind of jumped over the in-between period.
Yeah.
I mean, we did the 75 to 85 and then jumped to 95 to 2005. Jeff, in that intervening period, 85 to 95, are there highlights that you want to hit on?
Well, from the administrative side of things, again, it was a question of trying to build the IT group from within. At the same time that we were also pushing ahead with our teaching and research. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the decisions we made, which turned out to have some high opportunity costs, was that we felt that we could not afford to build everything ourselves. And so we went the route of, well, gifts are easy to get at this time. All the computer vendors were fighting for a share of mind. And so giving grants to business schools to capture business MBA students' share of mind was considered a marketing investment. The problem was trying to match what they wanted to donate with what we felt our needs were. And often what they wanted to donate were the business systems that might support a manufacturing organization, but would not be compatible with the needs for an educational institution. And certainly would not be compatible with the needs of an institution that was pioneering and doing research analyses of various kinds. And so this was a constant problem of trying to match the availability of what appeared to be a free resource with its true costs.
Right.
And one of the things that we would always say to ourselves is to be very, very careful what you wish for, because like the early 1401 debacle, the worst thing that could happen to you is to get a gift of some things that you might not want. And one thing that did happen, it was very embarrassing for me, both personally and professionally. I had done some consulting at Hewlett-Packard, and the outcome was not what I had expected. At that time, Hewlett-Packard had some integrated circuit manufacturing capabilities within Silicon Valley. Now it's all been outsourced to Asian countries. And one problem they had was, again, how do you allocate the capacity? And so I did some consulting for them, and turned out rather successful. And so they introduced me to the then CIO of Hewlett-Packard. And I remember this was at their corporate headquarters just across the street. And he was very laudatory about what I had contributed. And without realizing it, he was ushering me down the hallway. And we reached the front door, and he then said, "Thank you very much," and he literally pushed me out the front door and slammed the door, and turned to the security officer and said, "That person is never to be allowed back inside the Hewlett-Packard grounds again." And I was stunned. Later I found out the reason was that the calculations that I had done to do the allocation were done in a spreadsheet. And the corporate standard for administrative processing within Hewlett-Packard was everything had to be done in COBOL. When COBOL was a second-generation business processing language for file management. And I had violated the policy by going to a spreadsheet. But in the process, I had mentioned casually, HP had announced a revolutionary new machine called an HP 3000. And I had mentioned casually that this might be of some interest to some faculty at the business school. And one day I got a phone call. The truck is here. The machine is being delivered. Which room is it to be delivered to? I had not written anything up. There was no proposal. I had not asked for anything specifically. But apparently all they needed was a slight show of interest because of the implied endorsement. And it was, again, it was a machine designed for some administrative processing, and we had not even given it any consideration, serious consideration. And so that was one example of where I was professionally very embarrassed because again, be careful what you wish for. It seemed like interesting technology, but I hadn't done my homework.
Yeah.
And never dreamed that they would actually take me at my word to give that. One more story. This I don't want to jump ahead too much.
No, go ahead.
The major transition that occurred was later when we migrated away from the HP 3000 administrative system. The university was having similar troubles campus-wide with regard to IT administrative applications, and had decided to adopt its own EIS. The dominant players at that time were all focused on supply chain and manufacturing and other applications that were not relevant to a university. And so as a result of a study, and I think Tony may have been on the committee at the time, a decision was made to adopt a package called PeopleSoft, which was headquartered in the East Bay, and their orientation was starting with human resources and building the EIS around human resources, which seemed to be a better fit. And so the decision was made to go at the university level with PeopleSoft. During the process, I don't recall the exact timing, but during the process, Oracle Corporation acquired PeopleSoft.
Right.
While the implementation was going on.
Well, yeah, we had just made the decision and made the commitment to it. And Oracle, and Larry Ellison, the very outspoken CEO of Oracle, was quite contemptuous of the PeopleSoft applications, and he made some comments publicly, which are actually quite embarrassing, that his goal was to transition the customers away from PeopleSoft to something better, and that he was going to withdraw support of Oracle for PeopleSoft. And this led to lots of problems. It was a poor fit in the best of cases. At that time, I had proposed, and the deans had accepted, the creation of a lab called TEL. TEL stood for Technology Experimental Learning Lab. This was for entrepreneurial MBAs who were going to do startups and needed to do server-side programming of applications to deal with the web and their startups and so on. And so we created a lab. In fact, what I would do is I would take cast-off servers from Tony's group that were obsolete, and we would literally install them in the MBA lab because they were more than adequate for testing of ideas. And the joke at the time was that the university has gone through two major existential crises in its history. The first was the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906, which did a huge amount of damage to the campus. The second was the acquisition of Oracle PeopleSoft and the implementation thereof administratively. And to give you an idea, just one story, I'm sure there are many stories associated with how we stumbled forward on this. I had hired a second-year MBA student to be a teaching assistant in TEL. She had recruited for a job as an MBA student, a graduating MBA student, with a startup, and the startup imploded. And so she was fired before she was ever actually hired, before she graduated. And so she came to me and said, look, I'm looking for a job, and I need to start paying off my student loans. Is there any way you could employ me over the summer to do some work? And I said, yes. I have some tasks for you. You can write some tutorials, do some documentation, and so on. I'd be happy to hire you for 2 or 3 months to do this work, and then in the meantime, you can look for a full-time job. She became employed under the new Oracle PeopleSoft system. She then, as agreed upon, she resigned in August to accept a full-time job. She ended up becoming an early employee at PayPal. and so went on ultimately to a very successful career as a graduate MBA student. But in September and October, after she had left, the paychecks kept coming, being deposited, direct deposit into her bank accounts from Stanford as a continuing Stanford employee. And we couldn't sever her relationship with the university. We kept calling up, she's not working here. You know. At one point, I had to author letters asking her to write checks back to Stanford University to return the salary money. She had to get her tax withholding returned and so forth. It was a very embarrassing incident. It got settled. The next May, 9 months after she had left, she reappears as an employee of mine. Paychecks being deposited, tax withholding going to the state and to the federal government and so on. You know, the first time is excusable. Second time, not so excusable. So I began to get angry, and no one could explain to me.
How that happened.
I since realized that somehow somebody had set the bit that she was a seasonal employee, and so every May.
She reappeared.
And sure enough, a year later, she reappears for the third year in a row on the PeopleSoft system with deductions being done and so on. She was very, very good about it. I must confess, because it must have been extremely frustrating to her at the time.
She could have refused to pay back Stanford, right?
It could very well have been publicly very embarrassing for the business school, if not the university. But that was the sort of thing that went on. It was part of the friction of taking software developed in one industry and trying to
Applying
apply
it,
it in
yeah.
another, all the time trying to keep the ship afloat
Right.
with people who are struggling to get things done while trying to innovate. And this is a common problem that all organizations face.
And
Fortunately, this one managed to get through it. I think the Oracle system is now matured.
mature enough to.
And at least some of the most embarrassing incidents no longer occur. At least I haven't heard of any
None lately.
Recently.
Yeah.
But these were just some of the war stories that were associated with this. And we do have a couple of statistics I can throw out that I thought you might
So
find
what I
useful.
thought, maybe since we're at the
Yeah.
top of the hour, since we do have a set of people that assembled here, are there areas or questions that you guys have that the panelists can respond to?
Or comments.
Or comments?
Yeah.
Or your own stories that we don't know about? Doesn't look like.
A lot of consistencies from way back when to now in terms of, you know, great expectations and not enough resources. I mean, some of the stuff you're talking about, Jeff, you know, we talk about all the time still. So there's some things we haven't figured out as well as we figured some other things out.
Yeah. It's on the one hand, you know, kind of gratifying, but it's also kind of disconcerting that we still have similar problems that we are still dealing with.
Maybe what it is that as you solve problems, you create more capabilities, you just increase demand for
Right.
even more and more. So the expectations are there that you're never going to solve everything, because it just enlightens people to say, now can we do this, is really what it does.
And that's why bridging into the future as a sort of a metaphor of, you know, a bridge that keeps getting built is probably a good one. Perhaps we will just wrap this up at, you know, at this point, if there may be any
Well, I just wanted to
parting
give
remarks that you guys want to
I
make.
just wanted to give one thing, you know, because I shared it with the digital solutions team yesterday, I think it was, but I found still on the web, 17 years later, was a website which was the minutes from the MBA IT committee from May 17th, 1998. And I summarized it here to just give you a sense of what was on the student's mind at that point. That was 2 months before I arrived.
Nearly 2 decades ago.
Yeah, nearly two decades ago. So at the time, in no particular order, but online demands. They were calling for online exams and requiring faculty to post their notes online. So putting registration system online and having and making an algorithm that was reasonable is what they said. So students were requesting an intranet. So you can see why this is in 98. In 97 was when they first tried to conceive one of those. You can see that it was still a challenge for the students. They weren't giving up. They wanted it. And I really like the point. They even had ideas for what it would be called. One suggestion was a my.gsb. Another one was gsb.today. And it was meant to be like an individualized portal for them so that each one would get the information they wanted. And it'll never end, is the struggle with GSB unofficial email list. I remember that when I got here. I remember handing it over to Randy, and Randy Yee was, the students are just constantly bombarded with a massive information, both from the school officially and from their own independent clubs and activities, and they really couldn't get a handle on how to organize it is really what this was about. How to organize it, what was urgent, how to categorize it, things like that. They wanted access to an alumni database, which we have now. But at the time, the only thing available was postgrads, and that wasn't available to students. And so they really wanted to connect with the alumni. They wanted to find out what intern opportunities there might be out there, or jobs, or maybe someone who worked for a company or within an industry that they might want to collaborate with. So they were really interested in that. And the one that caught my attention was the reference to Facebook Online was a reference in there. But this is in 98, before Facebook. So they already, schools were already thinking about face sheets and sharing profiles, information, and all that back in 98. And the irony of it is the committee was complaining or commenting about how the students weren't using it. So, and then training. I mean, we think about it today as, everybody gets their device, and you just expected to know how to use it. In those days, students really didn't know how to use the technology, and faculty didn't know how to use the technology. So training was a real part of the job that we had in IT. And so it's just interesting to see that as an important issue for the students at that time. And then the other one is, this is internet access, and at the time, what they had was dial-up. And they were complaining, asking for more faster dial-up access. Regular DSL or cable modem really wasn't that available for most people. It wasn't affordable for most people to have. So it's just interesting to see the challenges that they had back in 1998, and how you could see many of these things are still there in different forms today.
Yeah. Jeff?
Well, we had, as a faculty member, we would run across a great many issues associated with administrative computing. One of the contact points we would have would be our summer executive programs. And these would be the SEP program or the collection of 2-week programs that we would have. And very often, senior-most managers would come here because they could afford to let their hair down and ask dumb questions that they would be embarrassed to ask of their own IT groups. And so we would hear everything under the sun, and we could go on and on with all the various stories. I remember early on when the dominant form of storage was floppy disk. And I remember we were teaching involving the use of a spreadsheet, and you had to boot up the machine with one floppy disk. You would then take that floppy disk out, and you would put the Lotus 123 disk in, and you would load Lotus 123, and then you would take that floppy disk out, and then you would put your data disk in that had the spreadsheet on it. So there was and I said, look, there's going to be a problem because people are naive about these sort of things. And so we better be careful and train the staff to be aware that you're going to be blindsided and you just don't know how. And sure enough, we had one that I only saw once. One of the CEOs complained that the machine wasn't accepting the floppy disks. And so we went over to look, And here was an IBM PC with the floppy drive in it, and 6 or 7 of these disks that had been stuck in all at once. And I knew better than to ask or derisively, or so I said I wanted to try to understand the metaphor that would cause someone to do that. And it was a perfectly reasonable metaphor. If you remember, the floppy drive has a slot, and that's reminiscent of a mail slot
Post office box.
in a post office. And so what you would do is you would stick in all these things. They would pile up inside, and little robots would run around inside and sort it all out for you automatically. Perfectly reasonable understanding.
Absolutely.
These were the sorts of things we had to deal with in terms of bringing people up to speed.
The mental models matter a great deal.
Another one complained about, was very impressed. I was using a Macintosh, and very impressed about how much more facile the pointing device I had was than the one that they had received. And I said, well, what one did you say? Well, it has a ball on top. And so I thought it was a pointing ball. And it said, no, it's very difficult because it's hard to operate the thumb, and then you have to push the whole thing forward in order to click. And I thought very quickly, I said, well, you can use it in 2 modes. You can roll it around on the desk, which is easy, or you can turn it over and operate it upside down. And it's your choice. Oh, that's a great idea. Third one was a person who thought a spreadsheet was a terrific piece of software because you can type in the stub entries, and then you can type in all the numbers, and the columns would line up. And so they were doing that, and then they got out their HP 12C and typed in the numbers on their HP 12C to sum them up, and then typed the results in on their PC.
Wonderful.
This was a fantastic piece of software that would allow all the columns to line up. And these were the sort of things we had to deal with, both on the administrative side and on the educational side during these formative periods. And you just never knew how you were going to be blindsided. Every day was going to be a surprise of one sort or another.
So the moral of the story is you put technology and people together, there are fantastic stories and opportunities that come out. Paul?
I just had a question. How is the role of faculty in relation to all of this technology change over time? And now you have younger faculty that are coming in, basically grown up with technology, as opposed to somebody who was teaching in the 70s. This was all new. How is the role of faculty? Do they become more, I assume they become much more involved and kind of proactive technology?
But again, there was kind of generational issues associated. To give you an example, we were building the other buildings before night. We built 2 more buildings, the Littlefield building and so forth, before we came over here. And one of the big issues was, would we have a lectern in the classroom that would control the projector or not? And that there were many faculty opposed. In fact, there was a cabal of older faculty who were opposed to anything other than chalkboard. Not a whiteboard, a chalkboard with chalk and erasers. That's how you distinguish yourself as a faculty member, was by the covering of chalk dust as part of and this was generational conflict, as you can imagine, between some of the older faculty and some of the newer faculty who came in and wanted to do the latest and greatest. What we had in our favor was the preference of the MBA students and others who were heavily attracted to Stanford as opposed to some of our competitors because of our association with technology. And we were able to use that as a lever to begin to move the school to be more aggressive in its adoption of at least the teaching technologies. It did come as a problem associated with how we also got the resources necessary to support the administrative applications. Because you could imagine there was a bias in favor of giving first priority to teaching and research applications, and assuming that somehow the administrative infrastructure would magically adapt, when in fact it often took, much, as I mentioned earlier, much more effort to get the administrative applications functional than to get individual teaching and research applications functional.
So Paul, another perspective on that. There was and will always be a generational effect associated with technology and where you land as far as the experience you had when you were younger. But I also find that it's not necessarily just generational. I find it really has to do with, well, what were the basic needs of the faculty member? If you're a quantitative faculty member, you've always needed something to help you accelerate your computations and things like that, so you gravitated to technology to make that work for you. And so when you experience technologies in other places, it wasn't as sort of shocking or revolting to you as a person exposed to that. Others who aren't necessarily in that regard, they are less likely to jump to the technology, is what I find. Even as we talked about recently when we did a lot of this new technology around education, it wasn't necessarily the senior faculty who were opposed to it. Some of them were more junior faculty who that wasn't their interest. Right. Their interest was something else. So I do want to make sure that we don't go away thinking it's just a generational thing.
I totally agree with that. I mean, even with our freshest crop of assistant professors, when we go talk to them, we see there is a spectrum of sort of technology savvy, technology, willingness to sort of work with technology in terms of what they're trying to do, both teaching and research. I would like to sort of bring the panel to a close. We spent actually 75 plus minutes in the conversation. I certainly want to thank our panelists, Tony and Jeff. It's been a extraordinarily interesting conversation. Certainly very interesting to hear all the stories of technology and its adoption into the school. Hopefully, all of you that assembled here, you had a good time listening to the panelists explore their experiences. Thank you very much.